WRINtv coverage of the 2013 IRMI Energy Risk and Insurance Conference is sponsored by WebCE. Mike Miller here reporting for World Risk and Insurance News. Environmental risks and pollution liability were key topics at the IRMI Energy Risk and Insurance Conference in Houston. Here are some of the highlights.
There are a lot of fears about the environmental risks, and I think a lot of that is just because a lot is unknown and is still being reviewed by the EPA and other bodies as well as by operators.
The EPA could come up and say, you can only flare this much, or there's different regulations around your electricity usage or water usage. I think there's just a lot of questions out there right now.
The EPA has emergency powers and has been active with litigation, but the EPA is also promulgating regulations relating to hydraulic fracturing. One of the areas that they focused on has been air pollution issues, which is something that really had not been looked at before, but they now have new regulations and new standards that the industry is going to have to meet. I believe most of these come into effect by 2015.
Okay, there's been a lot of money thrown at from the prosecution side of it. We're now seeing that the enforcement agencies are recruiting and they are being well funded to take cases to court. And the fines are heavy. We only have to look at something like BP recently at roughly 1.25 billion, but that's the big one. There are fines at $400 and $500 million, and also they're looking at criminal prosecution for the individuals. That starts to get scary when the board can go to jail.
The pollution risk obviously often has to do with underground situations, drilling through aquifers, people being concerned that maybe fracking is going up into the aquifers, as well as just well control events, some caused by casing failure, for example.
I think a lot of the initial concerns about hydraulic fracking perhaps polluting subsurface water tables has perhaps gone away a little bit. But there's no doubt that the concern remains about surface water.
The University of Texas and MIT both conducted studies, and they identified the environmental risk as being the surface risk as opposed to the subsurface risk, as really being the greater challenge for us to deal with.
I think some of what's been thrown out there I've heard it phrased as junk science as to whether or not we damage aquifers through that process. But then again, you buy a dedicated pollution program that is gradual in nature. Basically, it's a claims-made format. At least gives you a level of security to recover legal defenses. Because ultimately, I think that's what it may boil down to.
Environmental insurance plays a significant role in risk management for energy companies. Historically, there's always been sudden accidental coverage and control of well coverage for energy companies. But with claims such as groundwater pollution claims, drinking water claims, air emission claims, there's been a need for gradual pollution insurance.
There's a lot of operational risk they've got to be concerned about. Fracking is one, pollution coming from that, and pollution generally. They're buying the bail units in Bermuda because, pretty much a lot of the time, because of big pollution type incidences.
There's always a blind, yellow-bellied critter out there that somebody's going to come up with that could always put a moratorium on drilling, and that's has a traumatic effect on the energy business across the board. Not just E&P companies or drilling companies, but your secondary and tertiary outfits that are gaining profit from that. Cement companies, fracking companies, but also restaurants and hotels and housing and all these other things. So it's a pretty big issue, and it really rests mostly on our shoulders and how we're going to respond to those things.
For more of the interviews featured in this report, visit the WRINtv On-Demand Library.